In 2007, Sean the Muscle Shark Sherk was at the absolute peak of his career. He had just beaten Kenny Florian to become the UFC lightweight champion, cementing himself as one of the best 155ers in the world. The dude was relentless. His cardio was insane, his strength was unreal, and his wrestling pressure, downright suffocating. If Sean Sherk got his hands on you, you were going for a ride. And once you hit the mat, good luck getting back up. He was a machine built for grinding opponents into dust. The UFC's lightweight division had just been revived, and Sherk was supposed to be the guy to rule it for years. But within just 1 year, everything fell apart. A failed drug test, a nasty suspension, a brutal loss to BJ Penn, and injuries that would completely derail his career. Suddenly, the guy who was supposed to be a dominant champion was gone. Forgotten. Another what could have been in the sport of MMA. So what the heck happened to Sean Sherk? Well, let's take it all the way back to the beginning. Sean Sherk was born in St. Francis, Minnesota, a place where winters are brutal, people are tough, and wrestling is king. If you grew up in Minnesota and had any athletic aspirations, you probably wrestled. And let me tell you, Sean Sherk could wrestle his ass off. He started young, like really young, and quickly developed an obsession with the grind. Most kids wrestle for fun. Sherk wrestled like his life depended on it. And he wasn't the biggest guy, standing at just 5'6", but that meant that he had to work twice as hard to outmuscle and outwork his opponents. And he did. By the time he hit high school, Sherk was built like a tank. Thick neck, tree trunk legs, muscles popping out of muscles. He looked like a guy who spent his free time deadlifting small cars. But what really made him special was his work ethic. There are crazy stories about Sherk's training from back in the day. Some say he used to train with plastic bags wrapped around his body just to cut weight. Others claim that he did 300 push-ups before practice even started. And honestly, I believe all the rumors, because once you see how Sherk fought, you realize this guy trained like a lunatic. His wrestling style was built on pressure. He was a grinder, a suffocating, relentless nightmare to deal with. His opponents didn't just lose to him, they got drowned by him. By the time he was done with high school wrestling, he was already eyeing the next level. And back then, if you wanted to really test yourself, you didn't just wrestle, you fought. By the late 90s, the MMA scene was still the Wild West. No weight classes, bare-knuckle fights, sketchy promoters running underground events in casinos and bars. It was nuts. But it was the perfect time for Sean Sherk. This was a time when wrestlers were dominating the sport. Guys like Mark Coleman, Randy Couture, and Kevin Randleman were proving that if you could wrestle, you could control fights. And if there's one thing that Sean Sherk could do, it was wrestle. His early career was insane. Between 1999 and 2001, Sherk went on a 17-fight win streak. 17 straight wins. In an era where people were literally learning MMA on the fly. He fought anywhere and everywhere. Small venues, local shows, even Pride FC in Japan. Sherk's fights followed a simple blueprint. Take opponent down, hold them down like they owed him money, break their spirit, win. Yeah, it wasn't flashy, it wasn't wild, but what it was that it worked. And by 2001, the UFC took notice. They needed new blood in their stacked welterweight division, and Sean Sherk looked like exactly the kind of monster they needed. Sherk made his UFC debut in 2001, and immediately he made an impact. He ran through his first 3 opponents, using his signature relentless wrestling to grind out wins. By the time he was 19-0-1, he had earned his first title shot. And if you were fighting for the UFC welterweight belt in the early 2000s, there was only one guy standing in your way. Matt freaking Hughes. Now, if you weren't watching MMA back then, let me explain something to you. Matt Hughes wasn't just a champion. He was a different breed of human. Slamming people unconscious, drowning guys with wrestling, kicking ass, and not even cracking a smile. Sherk went in undefeated, but Hughes was just too much. They fought for 5 rounds, and while Sherk had his moments, Hughes was just one step ahead the entire time. He kept Sherk on the defensive, stuffed takedowns, and controlled him in a way that no one ever had before. It was Sherk's first loss, and it was a tough one. But if you thought Sherk was going to fade away, you clearly didn't know who you were dealing with. Sherk knew that he had two options: stay at 170 pounds and keep fighting welterweights, or drop down to 155 pounds and try to build a legacy there. At the time, the UFC had scrapped the lightweight division, so he was stuck fighting at welterweight. And for a while, he bounced around different promotions, destroying anyone in his way. But in 2006, the UFC officially brought back the lightweight division. And when they needed someone to be their first 155-pound champ in years, they called Sean Sherk. It was 2006, and the UFC's lightweight division is finally back in business. For a while, Dana White and the UFC weren't even sure if 155ers had a place in the promotion. The division had been scrapped in 2004, and a lot of its best fighters had been forced to either bulk up to 170 or fight in other organizations. But now the UFC was ready to bring it back, and they needed a legit guy to set the tone for the division. Someone who could prove that lightweights belonged in the UFC. And who do they pick to fight for the vacant lightweight belt? None other than Sean freaking Sherk. It made perfect sense. By this point, Sherk had racked up 32 wins in his career. His only losses? Matt Hughes, a certified welterweight GOAT, and then George St. Pierre, who went on to become, well, GSP. That's it. The dude was still one of the most dominant wrestlers in the game, and now at 155 pounds, he was about to be an absolute problem. But to get his hands on UFC gold, he had to go through Kenny Florian, a guy who had been making waves ever since The Ultimate Fighter Season 1. October 14th, 2006, UFC 64. This was it, the first UFC lightweight title fight in years. And if you watched Kenny Florian back then, you knew he wasn't just some random dude they decided to put against Sherk. He was a killer in his own right, with nasty elbows, solid jiu-jitsu, and a gritty, never-quit attitude. But here's the thing, Florian was still developing as a fighter, while Sherk already had 30-plus fights under his belt. He was already the muscle shark, Sean Sherk. From the opening bell, Sherk did exactly what we expected him to do: shoot, pressure, grind, and dominate. The man looked like a miniature tank. Every time he shot for a takedown, he did it with bad intentions. When he got top position, he wasn't just holding Florian down, he was pounding him with short, brutal shots. Florian tried to use his jiu-jitsu, throwing up submissions from the bottom, but Sherk was just too powerful, too strong, and too relentless. For 5 straight rounds, Sherk turned that octagon into his own personal wrestling mat. By the time it was over, there was zero doubt. Sean Sherk was the new UFC lightweight champion. He had finally done it. After years of grinding, wrestling, and battling in 2 weight classes, he was at the top of the division. And the UFC had their first real lightweight king in years. But let's pause for a second, because there was one thing that made all of this possible for Sherk: his absolutely insane training regimen. Now, if you've never seen footage of Sherk training, do yourself a favor and look it up. It is the stuff of MMA legend. The man trained like he was preparing for the end of the world. Weighted treadmill sprints, sledgehammer workouts, flipping giant tires, grueling high-intensity circuits that would break even elite athletes, 3-a-day workouts, 6 days a week. It was borderline psychotic. And that is exactly why he was so damn unstoppable in the early 2000s. When Sherk stepped into a cage, he wasn't just in shape. He was in Terminator mode. The man never got tired. Ever. And that's what made him such a nightmare at 155 pounds. He didn't have one-punch knockout power, but he didn't need it. He would just drown you in pressure, takedowns, and relentless ground and pound. For a while, it seemed like no one in the division could stop him. They didn't call him the Muscle Shark for nothing. He was built like a machine, and naturally, people started to wonder, was he on something? But then you'd see his training regimen, and it almost made sense. Almost. Because Sherk wasn't just working hard, he was obsessed. His workouts were legendary. Stories about his training would spread like folklore. The man would do 2-a-day wrestling practices, then hit the gym for powerlifting sessions, then end the night with hours of cardio. It was inhuman. So when whispers of steroids started circulating, his fans pushed back. No way, not Sherk, not a guy who trained like that. But the doubt was always there, lurking in the background. The MMA world had seen too many dominant athletes fall from grace. And then, just when Sherk had reached the top, everything came crashing down. So, what happened? Sherk was finally the UFC lightweight champion. He had grinded his way to the top, and now he had to defend his belt. His first title defense was set for July 7th, 2007 at UFC 73 against Hermes Franca, a dangerous Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specialist with knockout power. The fight itself? Classic Sherk. Once again, he ragdolled his opponent, took him down at will, and controlled the fight from start to finish. Sherk won a dominant decision and walked out of the octagon with the belt still around his waist. But what happened after the fight, that is what changed everything. Because a few weeks later, boom, news broke that Sean Sherk had failed his post-fight drug test for steroids. The California State Athletic Commission announced that Sherk had tested positive for nandrolone, an anabolic steroid. The punishment? A 1-year suspension. And just like that, his lightweight title was stripped away. Now, if you ask Sean Sherk, he'll tell you he was 100% innocent. He went to war with the Athletic Commission, appealing the suspension, claiming that he had never taken steroids and that the test results were flawed. His argument? He said that he had never used steroids in his life. He pointed out flaws in the testing process and how other athletes had been wrongfully accused before. He even hired his own experts to challenge the results. But the CSAC didn't budge. Even though Sherk fought tooth and nail to clear his name, his suspension was only reduced from 1 year to 6 months. And by that point, the damage was done. The UFC had already stripped him of his belt. And worse, his reputation took a major hit. Because once you get popped for PEDs in MMA, it follows you forever. Even if you're innocent, even if the test was flawed, people will always associate your name with steroids. And for Sean Sherk, this was a turning point in his career, because before the failed test, he was the guy who was supposed to rule the lightweight division for years. After the failed test, he was the guy who got stripped and lost his belt without ever being beaten in the cage. And when he finally returned to the octagon, it was to face BJ Penn, a guy who was about to change the lightweight division forever. Talk about a storm of misfortunes. After months of battling with the commission, defending his name, and watching the UFC move on without him, Sean Sherk was finally ready to return. But the lightweight division, it wasn't the same one he had left. Because while Sherk was stuck on the sidelines, BJ Penn had taken over. And when I say taken over, I mean he wrecked shop. Penn had fought Joe Stevenson for the vacant lightweight title at UFC 80 and had dismantled him, busting him open with one of the nastiest elbow strikes ever and then choking him out to become the new champ. So now, Sherk wasn't coming back to reclaim his title. He was coming back to fight for BJ Penn's title.
You know, I got my belt taken away, obviously, everyone knows that. So the next thing for me is just to get that belt back. I'll be fighting BJ Penn soon, so I just want to get in there and get that belt back and get everything back on track. You know, I had a lot of momentum going, so I'm looking forward to get everything going again for me.
After BJ Penn defeated Joe Daddy Stevenson, he said Sean Sherk is dead. What do you think about that?
Not scared, you know. I'm not dead. I'm right here.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's going to be a good fight.
May 24th, 2008, UFC 84. Sherk versus Penn for the UFC Lightweight Championship. It was being hyped as a true grudge match, and for good reason. Sherk hated the way that people had labeled him after the steroid controversy. He wanted to prove that he was still the best lightweight in the world. And BJ Penn, he wasn't helping. He had been running his mouth non-stop, calling Sherk a cheater and straight up disrespecting his entire legacy. You could see it in every interview, every press conference. These guys were on a collision course.
Sean Sherk, you're dead?
Yeah, I'm pissed. BJ talks a lot of There's a lot more on the line with all the false accusations, getting my belt taken away for something I didn't do, and the guy that has it is talking tons of about me.
And when fight night finally arrived, man, BJ Penn put on one of the best performances of his career. Now going into this fight, most people assumed that Sherk would do what he always did, wrestle, pressure, grind. But for some reason, he didn't wrestle. Instead, he tried to strike with BJ Penn. And listen, Sean Sherk's boxing wasn't bad. He had solid hands, fast combinations, and a decent jab. But BJ Penn had some of the best pure boxing in MMA history. The difference was clear right away. Every time Sherk tried to step in, Penn popped him with a crisp jab. Every time Sherk tried to throw a combination, Penn slipped, countered, and made him pay. And worst of all, Sherk couldn't get Penn down. He wanted to wrestle, he just couldn't. Penn's takedown defense was legendary, and every time Sherk shot, Penn stuffed it with ease. So what was left? Sherk was stuck, and Penn just picked him apart for 3 straight rounds. And right before the 3rd round ended, BJ Penn landed a brutal flying knee, followed by a flurry of punches that left Sherk slumped against the cage. It was over. BJ Penn had just knocked out Sean Sherk, and at that moment, it was clear the lightweight division belonged to the prodigy now. Sherk was still one of the best lightweights in the world, but this was a changing of the guard, and unfortunately for Sherk, things would never quite be the same again. After the loss to BJ Penn, Sherk wasn't done, not yet, but his body was starting to break down. See, for years, Sherk had pushed himself to the absolute limit. Remember his insane training that we talked about a while ago? The treadmill sprints with weights, the 3-a-day workouts, the grueling wrestling sessions? All of that took a toll. And by the time that 2009 rolled around, Sherk was dealing with chronic injuries. His shoulders were wrecked, his knees were shot, and his body wasn't recovering the same way anymore. And in MMA, that is a death sentence. Because when your body starts to slow down, but you're still fighting elite level killers, yeah, things get rough. Sherk had some solid performances after the BJ Penn fight. He fought Tyson Griffin in a crazy war at UFC 90 and won a hard-fought decision. But then, he lost to Frankie Edgar in 2009, which in hindsight wasn't a bad loss given what Edgar would go on to do in the division. And he fought Evan Dunham in 2010, barely squeaking out a controversial decision. And that was it. That was the last time Sean Sherk ever stepped foot inside the octagon. No big retirement announcement, no farewell fight, just gone. And that is what stung the most. Sherk had spent his entire career as one of the hardest working, most relentless fighters in the game. He prided himself on outworking every man who stood across from him. But now, his body wasn't letting him do it anymore. Every training camp became a battle, not just against his opponent, but against himself. The guy who had built a career on being a machine was breaking down piece by piece. He tried to fight through it. He tried to ignore the pain, to push past the injuries like he always had. But deep down, he knew he wasn't the same fighter anymore. Sherk later said that injuries were the main reason he had to walk away. His body just couldn't keep up anymore. I have been thinking about retirement for a while, Sherk said in his retirement announcement. I haven't fought in over 2 years. I've been injured for about 4 years now, and my body isn't able to recover the way it used to. I still love this sport very much and would love to compete, but my body won't let me train the way I need to. I couldn't even train for a fight, let alone fight. For the past 4 years, I have been dealing with injuries in my neck, shoulders, back, knees, and I need to accept that my time is done. He needed multiple surgeries, and every time he tried to train for a comeback, he would just end up injured again. So, in 2013, Sherk officially announced that he was retiring from MMA. And just like that, the Muscle Shark was done. So what the heck happened to Sean Sherk after he left MMA? Well, he actually stayed pretty low-key. Unlike a lot of other former UFC champs, Sherk didn't stay in the spotlight. He didn't chase a big coaching job or try to become a commentator. Instead, he just went back to normal life. He spent time with his family, he got involved in personal training and fitness coaching, and he stayed in ridiculous shape. Even in his mid-40s, Sherk looked like he could still outwork 90% of fighters today. The dude is a machine, but despite everything he accomplished, despite winning a UFC championship and having one of the most insane work ethics in MMA history, Sean Sherk is rarely talked about. And that brings us to the final part of this story. Why is Sean Sherk forgotten? Let's be real, Sean Sherk is one of the most overlooked UFC champions ever. Why? Well, a few reasons. Number 1, he fought in a weird era. Sherk's career peaked before the lightweight division really exploded. By the time the guys like BJ Penn, Frankie Edgar, and Khabib Nurmagomedov started dominating, Sherk was already on his way out. Number 2, the steroid controversy hurt his legacy. Fair or not, once you get popped for peds, it sticks with you forever. Even though Sherk always maintained his innocence, people just associate his name with that failed test. And number 3, the UFC doesn't promote him. Have you ever noticed how the UFC rarely talks about Sherk? They hype up Penn, Edgar, Khabib, Oliveira, but Sherk? Barely a mention. It's almost like they have just moved on from his era. Sean Sherk was one of the pioneers of the lightweight division. He showed that wrestlers could dominate at 155, and he set the blueprint for gritty, cardio-heavy pressure fighters like Khabib, Makhachev, Ferguson, and Edgar. Even if the UFC doesn't talk about him much, real MMA fans know. Sean Sherk was an absolute savage, and that is a legacy no promotion can erase.